Hello there, and welcome back to another episode of the Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting. We are going to be talking today all about the 3 types of podcast guest that you can get on your podcast. And I don't think I have ever heard anybody talk about podcast guests in these 3 categories before. So I'm not saying that I'm the first one to ever talk about it. I'm just saying that I've never heard anyone talk about this before. So I'm excited to bring you this information because when I explained it to somebody recently, they were like, oh my God, that's like such a different approach to think about podcast guest groupings in that way. So we are going to catch up and talk all about the 3 types of podcast guests that you could have on your podcast show at any point during, for interviews really. But before we get onto that, if you are new to the podcast, then welcome. It is great to have you here. Make sure that you are subscribed on whichever podcasting platform or YouTube that you are listening/watching on, because then you will be notified whenever a new episode comes out. It will be automatically downloaded for you to listen to and all of that goodness. And if you know somebody who is also a podcaster or is thinking of starting their own podcast, particularly as we are going to be heading into 2024 soon, which is crazy to think of. If you know somebody who is looking to start their own podcast, then please share this podcast with them, because we are now on episode 56, which is insane, which means that apart from this episode, we have got 55 other episodes which tell you, help you, instruct you, tutor you, all about how to set up, launch, grow, and scale your podcast and all those kinds of buzzwords. But basically, 56 episodes in total so far of everything podcasting related. And I think we've actually even got some bonus episodes in there as well. So probably more than that at this stage. But let's gloss over, let's launch them. Basically, it's great to have you. Make sure you're subscribed, and please let anybody else know who you think might also be interested in this podcast. But let's just crack on. Let's crack on with talking about the 3 types of guests that your podcast could have on there. Now, I think of these 3 groups as, and I'll explain a little bit more, this will make sense. I need to give you a bit of background as per usual with me. But these 3 groups, I feel that they build upon each other. And I think that if you are aiming to get big names on your podcast, now when I say big names, that could be a celebrity, that could just be somebody who's really, really popular in your niche, whatever that niche may look like to you. But sometimes it can be quite challenging to approach big names straight off, particularly if you're a brand new podcast, or particularly if you are relatively unknown to that individual, or completely unknown to that individual that you want to attract. And I think sometimes it's very easy for people to immediately think, oh, I want this big name on my podcast. But actually, there's going to be a lot of other people that you can have in your circle first. So let's crack on. And I think this will become a lot clearer as I go through these 3 different types of podcast guests. So the first type of podcast guest that you can have on your show are people who are already in your circle. So they could be friends, they could be relatives, colleagues, other hobbyists if your podcast is about a hobby, other people in your niche. But basically, the key thing about the first group of people is that you already know them in some way, shape, or form. You can approach them quite happily to say, hey, could you come on my show and talk about X, Y, and Z? And I think this is a really powerful group of people who we quite often forget about. And what I mean by that is, for example, in my first podcast, the Confident CEO podcast, one of my most successful episodes, and when I say successful, I mean most downloaded, most listened to, I got subscriptions via that particular episode, all this kind of thing, was through an interview that I did with a friend. And she does not have a global audience. She is not a massive celebrity. She doesn't have a crazy huge social gathering. It's just that it was a bloody good podcast episode, and the social media content that we created to share it was just so on point because it was such a good episode. And like I said, that was my most I think that was my most listened to episode for months and months and months and months. It took something like 9-10 months, something like that, to get an episode that beat a lot of the records that particular episode set for the podcast. And as I said, that particular individual, that guest, like I said, she's not a massive celebrity. I'll tell you who it is. It's my friend Julie, and I'll link that episode below so you can go and listen to it in the Confident CEO podcast. But, without that episode, I wouldn't have brought in a load of new subscribers, which was really interesting. So first of all, we've got to consider who is already in our circle, who can come onto our podcast and talk about things that are relevant to our podcast niche and our podcast topics. That's the important thing as well. You don't want to invite people on just to talk randomly about anything. The second group of people who can be available to you to guest on your podcast is people who you need to seek out. So for example, if I wanted to do an episode on a particular type of microphone that I don't know anybody who has got expertise on that type of microphone, then I would need to seek out somebody to interview about that particular piece of equipment. However, the key thing about this group of people is that they're still quite accessible to me. So I could reach out to, so for me, I use Twitter a lot. I talk to a lot of wonderful podcasters in the podcasting community over on Twitter. So to find somebody who specializes in a piece of, a mic or a piece of podcasting equipment, for me would be quite easy. I can reach out to that community and find a guest in that respect. And the key here is when I'd be approaching these individuals is saying, I have interviewed people before. Hey, go and check out these episodes where I've talked to X, Y, and Z. They might not know these people, but they can get an idea for the fact that you have interviewed somebody before. And even though you're a stranger, they've they can see that you've sought them out and that your podcast is legit and you're not just being a bit weird in contacting this person. And the good thing about contacting people who are outside of your circle is that you can be really specific with them as well and say, look, I really want you on the podcast because I've seen you talk about X, Y, and Z on social media. I think you'd be perfect for this because of your expertise. And this is what I want to talk about. And then you can decide if it's going to be an organic conversation or if it's going to be a more formalized Q&A, for example. But I think that sets you up really, really well for those introductions to people who, like I said, you don't know, but you want to take advantage of their expertise really for your audience. And the third group of people to get on your podcast, these are the bigger names. These are the experts in their fields, the experts in your niche, people who are incredibly well known. Maybe they've got a massive social media following. Maybe they are a bit more challenging to book. Maybe, dare I even say it, they've got some kind of celebrity status either in your niche or globally or what have you. Now, the thing to remember with this group of people is that sometimes they're easier to get on your podcast than you might think. Sometimes it takes a little bit more work. Sometimes when people say no, it doesn't mean that they're saying no forever. It just means no at this point in time. They just don't have time within their schedule at this moment to give you half an hour, whatever it is, for an interview for your podcast. But what's really key about approaching this group of people is that when you have approached effectively strangers in the past and had them on your show, you can turn around to this third group and say, hey, these are some examples of people who have been on my podcast before, because that's showing that you were able to go from, having your mate next door who was able to come onto your podcast to then you're building up to strangers. And then you are saying to people, hey, so-and-so came on my podcast. So therefore my podcast is legit. It's worth coming onto my podcast because somebody else of your caliber, or maybe just a little bit, kind of less of an expert than you, that less than expert, that sounds a little bit rude, but you know what I mean? Somebody who is more of an expert, but you're more of an expert than them on. It's showing that you are able to get different people onto your podcast. I hope I explained that right. It's like 5 o'clock on a Sunday evening, and to be honest with you, it's dark outside. You know, when it's dark outside, you just want to like get under a blanket and go to bed. That's kind of how I'm feeling. That's kind of my vibe at the moment. So I hope I explained that. I hope I explained that well. But the point that I'm making is that each of these groups of people can bring different things to your podcast. So the first one is people in your circle. They're easily accessible to you because, as I said, you know them. They're your friend, they're your family. And never discredit just because you know them. It doesn't mean that because they're not a stranger on the internet, doesn't mean that they can't appear on your podcast. Just because you didn't meet them through a Facebook group or, you know, in a Twitter DM or something, doesn't mean that they aren't going to make an amazing podcast episode with you. And the second group of people, as I said, the people who you need to actually seek out, but you know, you can still strike up a rapport with them and invite them on your podcast. Again, that's really powerful for bringing a different direction of conversation to your podcast. And finally, having those experts in their fields, again, is an amazing group of people to have on your podcast because it's just elevating the conversation even more. Now, what I would say though is don't fall into the trap just because you've got an expert or a celebrity or whoever on your podcast of thinking that just because they've got X amount of followers on Instagram or TikTok, wherever, that they're going to promote and all of those like 10,000, 100,000, however many followers are going to listen to your podcast and you're suddenly going to become the next Stephen Bartlett or Joe Rogan. It doesn't work like that. And I've done a previous episode on that and I can't remember which number it is, but I'll make sure it's tagged down in the show notes. But the point is that each of these different groups of people can really bring something to your podcast. And that's key, is that remembering when you have somebody come onto your podcast that you interview on your podcast, it's considering to yourself, what are they bringing that is going to bring value to my audience? Because at the end of the day, everything has to be about your audience, because if there's no value to your audience, there is going to be no audience because no one's going to want to listen to your podcast otherwise. So it's always thinking, you know, what is this particular individual going to bring my audience in terms of, will it be education? Will it be how to? Will it be entertainment? What is that value that they are providing? And as I said, sometimes it's about building up to having people on your podcast as well. So I had, again, on the Confident CEO podcast, I was fortunate enough to have Melissa Guller, who is a podcast and course creation expert on my podcast. Her CV is absolutely amazing. Her online, what am I trying to say? Her social media followership is also absolutely stunning. I did not reach out to her first off and kind of go, hey, I've started this podcast, come and be a guest. I actually kind of bided my time a little bit to approach her. And when I did approach her, I was able to say, these are the different people who have come on my podcast kind of ahead of you. And from that, she was able to see, oh, this part, and I know this because she actually said this to me off interview. She said, what I liked about the way that you approached me with your request or invitation to come on the podcast is that you gave me some names that I was then able to look up those people's names and go, oh yeah, they are actually legit people and they're actually quite big in what it is that they're talking about. They're experts in their fields. And she said, then I looked up your podcast and I was able to see that your podcast was legit. And she was able to see that actually being on my podcast was worthwhile for my audience. And in her words, she was like, I could tell that you actually cared because your your email that you sent to me, she goes, it was personable. You were able to tell me why it was that you wanted me on the podcast. So that was amazing. I'm going to link that episode down in the show notes as well for you to listen to. And what I also have is I've got a masterclass actually about booking bigger guests onto your podcast. I'm going to link that down in the show notes. And I've actually got within that masterclass the exact template, the exact email that I sent to Melissa to get her on the show. And then there's a couple of other templates of how I got other people on the Confident CEO podcast as well. So if that is something that's of interest to you, again, as I said, hit the links down in the show notes, because I think sometimes it can be really challenging knowing how to put an email together, a proposal, invitation, call it what you will, to ask people to come onto your podcast. So do check that out in the show notes and you can steal all of those templates there. But otherwise, I hope this has been useful to you as ever. Make sure that you are subscribed to the podcast. Make sure that you are following me on Twitter and TikTok to know when new episodes are coming out. And otherwise, I hope that you and otherwise take care, and I will see you next episode.